What is going on, everyone? My name is Andy. Welcome back to another FPL video. In this one, I'm going to talk about free hit 33, run through a draft that I would go for if I was using the chip this week, plus some alternative options as well. So let's get straight into it. So let's start with the defensive players. Just a quick note that my bench is pretty terrible, and that's because of my low team value. So to fit in all the players that I wanted to in the main 11, I had to make some sacrifices, but it shouldn't be a concern because I hope that all the players I've picked will start at least once, if not twice, and I won't need the bench. But obviously, if you have more team value than me, then absolutely make sure your bench is better than what I've gone with at the moment. My back three and goalkeeper, I would say, are going to be pretty standard on most free hit drafts. So I've gone for double Arsenal defence, Raya and Saliba, both pretty secure when it comes to minutes. The only reason not to go double Arsenal defence is if you want to go double Arsenal attack. And that's absolutely fine if you want to do that. But when I look at the attackers I've picked, there's no one where I think, oh, that Arsenal attacker is much better than the player I've gone for. Whereas with the defenders, I think they are much better than most options this week. So Raya and Saliba are pretty straightforward. You could go for a different goalkeeper and go for like Saliba and Kivior or Saliba and Timber, but that means you're not going with one of Vardiol and Munoz. And again, they would definitely be in my free hit draft. Vardiol, most nailed Man City defender, probably the most attacking as well. Nico O'Reilly's looked pretty attacking, but he's listed as a midfielder in FPL, so you don't want to be picking him. So Vardiol is pretty straightforward. Ruben Dias is good, but he's not as good as Vardiol, I would say. And then I've gone for Munoz from Crystal Palace, the most attacking Crystal Palace defender. I think when you're on free hit, where possible, you want to try and pick the differential option that non-free hitters don't own or won't be able to get to. But I think with defence, it's very hard to do that. Like if you pick a different Crystal Palace defender, you're basically putting yourself at a disadvantage for no reason. So even though Munoz is very heavily owned, I just probably wouldn't back against him. I think with Crystal Palace in general, there is potential for rotation in the Arsenal game because it's right before their FA Cup semi-final. So they play Arsenal on Wednesday, then the FA Cup semi-final on Saturday, which is obviously a huge game for them. Palace not going to get relegated. They're probably not going to push for Europe either. But I still think I'd pick Munoz. I guess if I didn't want to go there, if I wanted to reduce the number of Palace players, then you could go for an Aston Villa defender. But I'd probably go for Martinez in goal and then Timber or Kivior in the back three, rather than going for Konza and Raya, if that makes sense. There's probably not a lot in it, but if you think Timber's going to start twice, then he's probably more attacking than someone like Konza. But I think I would just go for Munoz. We know what he can deliver from an attacking point of view. Bournemouth at home is not awful, and so that's why I think he's going to be in most drafts. So I think midfield is probably where you're going to be able to pick the most amount of differential picks. So for example, for my team where I'm not on free hit, I'm almost certainly going to buy Morgan Rogers because his minutes are so good and have been for the whole season. But on free hit, I'd be tempted to go for Rashford instead. At the moment, it looks like he's first choice ahead of Ollie Watkins. I don't know if that will continue. I also don't know if Ollie Watkins is still carrying an injury, which is making Rashford play ahead of him. But right now, he does seem to be in that first 11. Unai Emery has told us that he's first choice penalty taker, and he is a differential compared to Morgan Rogers. People will definitely buy Rashford this week, and I might talk myself into it as well, because if he's going to continue playing, I think he is better than Rogers. But most people not on free hit will just pick the safer option. So Rashford is definitely someone I would look at if you're free hitting this week. I think, despite what I said about possible rotation against Arsenal, I would still go for Crystal Palace attackers. We know that Sarr is heavier owned than Eze. Even in game week 31, when Eze got a 9-pointer and Sarr blanked, going into game week 32, Eze was still quite a lot lower owned. So I would definitely pick him over Sarr at this point. And then Kevin De Bruyne, this is definitely a knee-jerk reaction, right? He did really well in game week 32. Now, all of a sudden, everyone is looking at him. He said himself, this is the first time I think he's been playing pain-free for about 6 weeks. I might have that quite wrong, but it was something along those lines. I can't sit here and guarantee you that De Bruyne is going to start both games because his minutes have been all over the place all season, and I don't really think he's necessarily capable of playing week in, week out anymore, and that's probably part of the reason that he's leaving at the end of the season. But at the moment, because he hasn't played that often, and there's not a huge amount of other options that Pep has to play in those central roles, there is every chance he'll start both of Everton away, Villa at home. At a minimum, he should start at least one. And because you're on free hit, you're not having to worry long-term about what his minutes will be. So again, as a non-free hitter, I've got no interest in buying De Bruyne at all. Not only because of the minutes thing, but also because it's very difficult to get to him with the position that I'm in. Some people with Foden will probably go straight to De Bruyne now, but don't think that De Bruyne's ownership is suddenly going to skyrocket, because it won't. He'll still be very low owned, and I think for that reason, I would try and fit him in. Also, you probably want, if you can, to go for triple Man City. I think Foden obviously was out of the squad for 32. Savinho hasn't started 2 games in a row. Doku, Grealish aren't any safer for minutes. So there's no midfielder in that Man City team that is a dead cert as a great option anyway. So why not just pick Kevin De Bruyne? Also, this might be the last time you ever pick Kevin De Bruyne in FPL. We know he's leaving at the end of the season. I suspect he won't stay in the Premier League, and most people aren't going to pick him up in terms of a normal transfer in. So that's your 3 differentials. Saka's in, not a differential, but I think he has to be picked. He's the best Arsenal attacker. I think he's been benched 3... I don't think. He has been benched 3 times in a row since he's back from injury. I think that's massively because, one, it was a long-term injury, but also the Real Madrid game. Once that Real Madrid game is played this week, if he comes through unscathed, I think he'll start both games in 33. Yes, his minutes probably won't be as good as we've seen in the past. I don't expect him to play 90 minutes against Ipswich and Palace, but I don't think he's just going to permanently get benched until the next Champions League game. You want to be able to build up match fitness as well. So I think he'll be okay, and I would definitely pick him. And then I've gone for Salah, which is in some ways such an obvious pick because it's Leicester. I'm going to get quite a few questions this week from free hitters. Would you just go 11 double game weekers? I would consider it. So with this draft, you could just go for Morgan Rogers instead of Salah and go for Rashford and Rogers double up, which would obviously be massively differential because you're betting against Salah. If Salah had any other fixture that wasn't against a... Basically, unless he's playing... Sorry, let me rephrase that. If he's playing anyone that's not Leicester, Southampton, Ipswich, I would consider leaving him out. But I would just think the damage he could do against Leicester, like he could easily outscore most of these double game week players. It's such a good fixture. Like Brighton put up 4 XG against them at the weekend. I know a lot of that was penalties. Even if you remove the penalties, they've still put up over 2 XG fairly easily. Liverpool are capable of doing exactly the same thing. And I think I've got triple Palace, I've got triple Man City, I've got triple Arsenal. The only team I'm not tripled on is Villa. So that's the only dilemma. Is it Rodgers or is it Salah? Or if you want to really pick Rodgers, then it's Rashford versus Salah. I think it's close. I think if you want to go for the double game week, you should. And usually I would on free hit in a double game week go 11 doublers. But Salah against a team that's going to get relegated, it's really difficult to go against him. And so I would probably include him and go Salah plus 10 doublers. And then up front, I've got Mateta and Marmoush in a 3-5-2. I know people are concerned about Mateta at the moment, so I'll talk about him in a second. With Marmoush, that's one of the most obvious picks on free hit 33. He should be straight in your team, one of the first names in the squad. When you think about the forward options from the 4 teams that are doubling, Arsenal don't have any fit forwards. Watkins is not starting regularly at the moment. And like I said, people have got concerns about Mateta. So Marmoush is straight in. There shouldn't be any arguments about that whatsoever. With Mateta, he was subbed at half-time against Man City in the first game of Game Week 32. At the time of recording, we haven't seen the second game yet. Glasner said it was tactical, not injury-related. He also said that he regrets changing the setup, so the way that Palace were playing, but he didn't regret subbing Mateta. He wasn't winning enough duels and stuff like that. So there is some concerns about his minutes going forward, especially with Nketiah back from suspension. You'll get to see the second game of 32 before you make any decisions. I suspect that Mateta will start again, and therefore he'll probably start the Bournemouth game in 33 and probably the Arsenal one if there's not a huge amount of rotation. It could be that Nketiah gets the Arsenal game because of the FA Cup semi-final, but because I don't feel confident enough to pick Watkins right now, and there's no Arsenal forwards, Mateta's almost in by default. And when you look at the fixtures for Game Week 33 in terms of single game weeks, there's not a huge amount where I think I would definitely pick a single game week forward over Mateta. So Visser against Brighton or João Pedro against Brentford away, it's okay, but it's not better than Mateta, I would say. You're not going to pick an Everton forward against Man City. West Ham versus Southampton, great, but the player you'd really want to go for there if you're picking an attacker is Bowen, who's a midfielder. Isak versus Villa away, maybe. You could say he's better than Mateta. But if there's a chance that Mateta's going to start twice, you would take the risk on the double game week, right? And I'm not going to go through every single match, but there ain't many forwards there that I would pick over him. So unless he gets benched in the second game of 32, I wouldn't have a huge amount of concerns as it stands. The other thing to say, if Watkins starts against PSG this week for the second leg, and it looks like it's a pretty full-strength team, which I'm sure it will be, then maybe he's past any injury concerns. Maybe he's back in ahead of Rashford, and then maybe you take a punt on Watkins instead, because Watkins' ownership will be so much lower than Mateta. But if Watkins is benched again, it's really hard to make a case for him at the moment. He may not start either of the games in 33. And so as it stands, I'd probably go Mateta. Out of that whole squad, Mateta's probably the one I have the most worries about. But in some ways, I'm not that worried because there's not many other options to look at. I guess Salah versus like a Rodgers is definitely something to think about. Even with De Bruyne, I'm not fully concerned generally about his minutes, but there's not a huge amount of other Man City players to go for. You could go for Ruben Dias instead of Munoz, for example, and then do De Bruyne to Rodgers and have Rodgers and Rashford plus Salah. That could work. But I just think De Bruyne is such a big differential. And the fixtures are pretty good for Man City that I would probably just go there. So, like I said, I think a lot of these players pick themselves. Reyes, Saliba, Vardy, Munoz, Marmoush, Saka, probably Salah for me, probably Eze. 8 players I would almost certainly have. I think if Rashford starts against PSG, in some ways that makes me more confident of picking him for 33. And there's not a huge amount of other options, double game weekers, to consider. Let me just bring this up a second. I did put a list of alternative picks together, but I think I've mentioned most of them. Like Henderson in goal, Munoz is better. You could go for Martinez if you really don't want to pick Vardy or Saliba or whoever, right? So there are other options. If Edison's out, because he went off with an injury in the last game, then maybe Ortega instead as a differential. But again, then you're either dropping Vardy or going double Man City defence and dropping Marmoush or De Bruyne. Defenders, Timber, Kivior, Diaz, I've mentioned. Konza for security of minutes from Villa. If you wanted to go outside of that, I'd probably go Luka Dean, but Maatsen might start one of the games. Midfielders, Marino, Odegaard, Martinelli from Arsenal if you want to double up. I'd probably go Odegaard as my favourite of those 3, but Marino playing as the number 9 got to be considered. If you don't want to go for De Bruyne, Savinho, I think will get back into the team sooner rather than later. I think because Man City won't be playing against wing-backs, possibly that's why he's not been playing his wide players, like Doku, Savinho, Grealish, etc. I can't guarantee it, though. I think based on what we saw in the last game, it's probably got to be De Bruyne. Foden might not even be fit. Rodgers, I've mentioned. Asensio as well, you could look at. But again, I think Rodgers is just safer for minutes. And then Sarr, if you don't want to go for Eze. And forwards, I mentioned Watkins. So that's about it for alternative picks. I think, again, most of these players pick themselves. So if you're on Free Hit 33, let me know what you would change in the comments below. If you enjoyed that, make sure to give it a like. Hit that subscribe button. I'll be back tomorrow for another video.